Well, good morning. Nice to see so many people here. And my name is Mark Seward. I'm Senior Director for Security and Compliance at Splunk. And I'm going to have a bit of a talk about preventing and responding to future cyber attacks. Hopefully you'll all come out with something you can take back to your agencies or your offices tomorrow and use out of this, or at least have a little bit of different thinking about the way the future of cyber attacks is going to look. I'm going to talk about why attacks today are so successful, and we're going to talk a little bit about why advanced threats are hard to detect. This information up here is, pardon me, this information up here is about 140 different attacks that were seen by a group called the Mandiant organization. How many people in here have heard of them? Lots of heads nodding. These came out of their M-Trends report from 2012 and 2013. And again, this represents about 140 different attacks. And this really is pretty typical given information that's out from the Verizon breach report and other reports that are out there. And basically in 100% of the attacks that they saw against companies and government, 100% of the time, valid credentials were actually used to gain access to data, to gain access to intellectual property, to basically cause harm to systems and companies. The median number of days before detection, 243. That's a long time. It was worse last year by quite a bit. It was well over 300 days. I still think this is kind of bad. The average number of systems accessed, about 40. Again, that's down slightly from last year. That's about 50 last year. And 63% of victims were notified by an external entity. So, you get the phone call, right, from, in some cases, if you're a financial institution, the FBI. In some cases, a partner, perhaps. In some cases, a supplier. And you're not detecting these things, at least in these 140 cases, 63% of the time. There's one statistic that isn't up here that should be, and that is in the Verizon data breach report. They talked about the fact that in nearly 100% of the cases, evidence of these breaches was in their log data. And in most cases, those companies had some sort of security information and event management system. And we'll talk a little bit more about the link between some of the problems we're seeing and some of the thinking that's going on around security today and some of the tools that are currently in use. This is the way attackers are thinking, and again, this changes a bit over time, but this, as a rule, is the way attackers are gaining information about you, about your people, about your customers, about your citizenry, to try to figure out how to steal what might be valuable. And there's all kinds of examples of where attackers found sort of the mother lode of information. The organizational chart, for example, that's buried in someone's email or buried on a server someplace. And what they're able to do with that, of course, is actually find out who they want to target. And the people they want to target are not necessarily the people you think they want to target. They're looking for people with admin credentials, people who have admin rights to Active Directory or Exchange or to SharePoint or to some other servers that are of importance to the organization. They're not necessarily after your chief security officer, your CIO, although that happens. Mostly it's around trying to gain access to people who have the keys to the kingdom. So they're looking for an organizational chart. Attackers also find ways to get at network infrastructure diagrams so that they can easily figure out how to spread their malware from one place to another. They're also looking at system documentation. If you have a repository of system documentation, maybe it's a documentation about specific applications that your agency is using, that kind of information, or even configuration files and gold standard build information for particular servers. Anything like that that they can lay their hands on to understand how your systems are put together. And then VPN configuration files is kind of a new one that got added to the list this year, and because they're looking for ways that allow them to piggyback their particular attack from one place to another. Again, the statistic, the 63% statistic I showed earlier about the types of attacks where a partner actually says, hey, we think you probably have a problem because we're seeing something else. It's because those two particular companies are linked somehow via some kind of VPN, and they're looking to piggyback across that VPN to gain access to what they really want. So when you think about it, you're actually going against people, the organizational chart, you're going against the way the network is built, you're looking at processes in the organization, you're looking at technology. People, processes, and technology. It comes back to all of that, and something that we're really all familiar with. And, you know, I'm a lazy attacker, right? I don't want to work a lot to try to get access to your data. I want to work as little as possible. So I'm going to look for this stuff so that I can get some clues as to how to get at you. Why are attacks successful? You know, there's a lot of reasons, and I'm going to go through a few of those. I actually have another slide that I typically show here that has about 5 clocks across the top. And the first clock is at 8 o'clock in the morning, and the last clock is at 8 o'clock at night. That's a 12-hour time span where IT operations sees something that's unusual. Maybe they get a call from a help desk or something like that, and then they begin to notice there's a slowdown in the responsiveness of a particular portal that's citizen-facing, that is not responding properly. They try to fix it themselves first. About 2 or 3 hours go by. They get some other calls from some other folks that say, hey, this isn't working the way it's supposed to. And then they say, well, maybe we have a security event. And then they engage the security team, and the first thing the security team says is, we want the logs from all of those servers, or we want the logs from the infrastructure. And so the IT operations people go back and have to figure out how to extract the logs and get those to the security team. The security team then analyzes all of that log data and tries to figure out what's going on. That takes time. And then they actually figure out what's going on, and then they respond appropriately. And the clock is ticking during that entire time. And these silos in between all of these different organizations add to that amount of time. And if you look at this kind of cute picture here, for example, you've got these people inside of that silo right there, and you've got other silos in the background. Well, there's a lot of room for attackers to sort of run between all of that and use that amount of time that it takes to diagnose those issues to get at data. So defenders, really, we're all sort of isolated in our own sort of narrow defensive zones. And then also the fact that not only are the attackers taking advantage of the amount of time that we allow them to sort of zigzag their way around us, but also they're pretty creative. And about a year ago, I was in a conference, and I was listening to the CISO of eBay talk about this, where he had his secretary come up to him, and she said, hey, you know, my computer's acting kind of funny. Can you help me with this? And he said, you know, I really don't have time to deal with it. Take it over to IT, see what they can do. And sure enough, it took about 20 minutes. And IT, they found a problem, and they sort of raised the flag of success. They removed this piece of malware, and she said, fine, I'm gone. 2 weeks later, she comes back to the CISO again, and she says, my computer is still acting kind of weird. And when you think about it, this is his administrative assistant. This is the person that knows a lot about him. This is the person that has his calendar, knows where he goes, knows what he does. And he says, okay, let me give your computer to these crack group of guys that I have over here in my shop. And it took them about half a day. And they found a very, very, very sophisticated piece of malware that was extracting data from her computer and shipping it off to somewhere else. Written by the same people was the malware that was found by the IT department. So when you think about it, what attackers are actually doing is they are actually pointing the finger and say, look over there. look over here at this sacrificial piece of malware we've given you so you can raise that flag of success. Because we know IT teams are stressed. We know they don't have time to really dig deep into this kind of stuff for every single person in an organization. So they are actually very creative. They are actually using diversionary tactics to try to get what they want. People are the weak link in your organization. You know, and all of you know this kind of stuff. I mean, people will continue to be preyed upon by other people over trust. And I'm not going to go too much into this because all of you know this. It only takes one click to really, for the attacker to be right, to actually engage someone. And again, I go back to that scenario where somebody knows a lot about you, somebody knows where you go, what you do, somebody knows when your wife's birthday is, somebody knows if they see your calendar, they know that kind of stuff. They know what kind of holidays you have, they know what kind of trips you're going to take. I mean, so I can engage you in a conversation, and I actually have I've actually done this a couple of times, where I will try to social engineer someone into believing I am somebody that knows them personally. And a little bit about me. I used to be, I was a professional actor before I got into cybersecurity. And I spent 8 years directing plays and acting in plays in Chicago back in the late 80s. And I've actually found that background to be very helpful when I try to go into a facility or a place and I try to social engineer somebody. One of my, I'm getting away from the presentation here for about 30 more seconds. One of my favorite things is what I call the butt lurch. Ever seen the butt lurch? Basically, you have a big box in your arm, and you've got you pretend you have your badge in your pocket, and you're trying to sidle up to the badge reader, and somebody takes pity on you and opens the door and let you in, so you can look at passwords that people have on their sticky notes next to their desks. Anyway, so I digress. Really, there's the things that people do on a daily basis are log into the IT systems, they use email, they surf the web, they use systems, they send files, they get files, they do all of these kinds of things, all these normal activities behind credentials that they log in with. So we need to really take a look at what our people are doing, not necessarily to intrude upon their privacy, not necessarily to intrude upon the fact that we think they're doing something bad, but simply to understand what's normal and what's not for behavior. And people are still going to be the weakest link we've got. Attackers are also taking advantage of partners. I mentioned this earlier on, where you've got, company B doesn't seem vulnerable because I've tried to get at company B and I've worked really hard and I can't figure out how to get at them. But I know that they have suppliers or they have providers or they have outsourced some particular service. So I'm looking to try to access them through company A or company O, and I'm trying to infect them, and I'm basically trying to figure out how to piggyback across that VPN or how to gain trusted access to get access to company B, whose materials that I really want. When I was actually a security practitioner and I was actually running a security information event management deployment myself, I was an extremely happy person because basically I would wait for things to happen and then I would go react to them for the most part. And I was really happy because I knew even then, although I didn't really know the term big data, I knew I had a big data problem. I was basically getting all kinds of data in from all kinds of different sources all the time. And I was like, my God, I can't look at all this stuff. Thank God I have this SIM that only collects certain types of data that was allowed by the SIM vendor, that actually reduced that data in volume because it basically took out anything that the SIM vendor felt was extraneous to make sure it fit into a particular schema and actually fit into a database that I could actually search. And then, thank goodness, that it was actually performing against some rules and creating some alerts that I could sit back in my chair and say, okay, I have all of this stuff in place, I have this stuff under control, now I'm going to wait for things to happen. And I was fat, dumb, and happy. But it took a long time before I really realized that that really is a problem, because the SIM vendor was removing a lot of context from my data. The SIM vendor wasn't able to collect easily the custom applications that really drive the business or the agency forward and actually provide the service that we need to sell or the service we need to provide. And it really restricted my visibility. In reality, what happened was, it meant that I needed to know what I needed for an investigation before an investigation ever happened. Because there was always a chance that I would reach a dead end. I talked to a bank in Southern California who said when they had their SIM deployed, they figured out that they were reaching the wrong root cause analysis 90% of the time, because they didn't have the context, because they weren't able to see far enough beyond the security realm, because the vendor was normalizing data and pulling data out of it that might be valuable. And I talked to other vendors. I don't know if FireEye's out there right now. Imperva, I've talked to them as well. And they have really, really rich information that they send to security professionals. They say, hey, wow, this is what's happening, and we're going to send data to the SIM product, the supposed single pane of glass where everybody's looking. And it turns out that they have so much data that they're only able to send about 25% of it to that SIM. And so they're actually having to leave out data that they think is relevant for security professionals to fit into the SIM paradigm, to fit into that database, to fit in so that to that particular format. So basically, it was taking and really sort of giving me what I call a homogenized milk kind of view of what was really happening in my environment, although I wouldn't have admitted that when I was actually running a SIM at the time. And it also made me forget how to do security, because it really did create a dependence. I really was dependent on that product. I wasn't thinking creatively anymore. I was really just sort of sitting there waiting for things to happen. And the cold case problem is a big one for me because, and it only happened to me once, but what happened was I got an alert that said I had a virus outbreak in my organization, and it had spread over 100 systems. And I went, thank God the SIM told me this. So I went and our team went through and we fixed all those systems. And then about 3 weeks later, somebody came to me and said, oh, we have about 100 systems that you weren't collecting data from at the time. We'd like to give you that information now, 3 weeks later, and have you figure out whether or not that information might change the outcome that you had when you fixed this stuff. And I just found a wall and I just banged my head against it, because these are not hot tub timelines. You can't go back in time and figure out how an event might have changed with new information. In other words, I can't be the thing that I wanted to be when I went into this profession and got out of acting, went into this profession in the first place. I wanted to be Columbo, right? I wanted to be a detective. I wanted to go out and figure out what was wrong. And you can't do that if you can't go back in time and look at a cold case with new evidence and try to figure out whether or not the verdict is still the same. Can't do it. It's a one-way trip to those alerts that you get. So how much data do we really need? I mean, everybody's talking about big data. It's kind of the buzz right now. It's a big talking point out there. How much data do we need? And we really need to have as much data as we can to tell this kind of a story. You know, all of you have read newspapers, although people keep telling me that I was watching a show the other night and somebody said, can you explain what a magazine is to our audience? And I was like, oh my God. Because people are on the web and all that kind of stuff. Never mind. But the point is that when you read the first paragraph of a web-based article or a newspaper, the 5 W's are answered for you in the first paragraph. And then you can decide if you want to read on, right? And it's no coincidence that we all need that information. We all need the who, what, when, where, and why. And we need to be able to have all of that information before we can really make accurate decisions, before we can truly get to root cause analysis about something that's going on in our environment. So you really need all of that. And the only way to do that is to be able to collect all that data unstructured or structured, be able to pull all of the data, all the context we need into a single system. The other thing we're seeing is that unstructured data, particularly pieces of data that come from control systems, and I don't know how many of you deal with control systems, but they're a big sort of black hole for security teams right now. In other words, in business, if I'm Intel, and I'm running a chip manufacturing operation, for example, and I have somebody that basically decides he's disgruntled that day and decides to change the settings on the heating control systems, for example, so that the fans blow in instead of blow out, so that the air pressure in the room is changed somehow, so that those chips that were being manufactured are somehow contaminated. Yet those things get out the door. Those things get into onto the retail shelves. Somebody buys that. Somebody tweets that this thing is really bad, and they find out that the press finds out that a whole raft of these things have gotten out the door, and then you've got some sort of reputational issue that's going to damage a company's stock price. So when we begin to think about not only the kinds of data we would traditionally collect, the data from servers, the data from your security infrastructure, the data from applications, we also need to think about the lights, the stop lights, the traffic lights, the switches in a rail yard, the GPS data that you can receive from all of your trucks when you're pre-dispatching things for snow removal in cold weather. All of those kinds of data are potentially important in a security investigation. So we really have to begin to start changing our thinking about what's relevant data in security, and that's a big problem for lots of folks. I was at a workshop about a year ago, and it was a industrial control system, a SCADA workshop, and I hadn't done any sort of command line work in a long time, although I had done that before. And they sat me down in a chair and said, "Today we're going to hack all the stoplights." And he had a little model of the stoplights, of a couple of different stoplights, to scale. And he had real live control systems. And with almost no experience in 10 years, I was actually able to sit down and change all those stoplights to red. It was pretty easy to do. And frankly, I was at Black Hat about 3 months ago and watched a demonstration of somebody actually changing the cameras, security cameras, for example, where they actually they did this live. They had a camera right on the stage, and they set a glass of beer down in front of the camera, and they made it disappear. That's because a lot of the major camera vendors actually have their passwords and usernames embedded in their source code, so it doesn't take long to try to figure out this stuff. And so we're really vulnerable there, and that's something that we need to start thinking about if we're going to try to worry about what you all worry about, which is the safety of the public, and trying to resolve some of these issues. So you've got the traditional kind of SIM view of what's relevant, and then you have everything else. And everything else is kind of slowly creeping up on us, because that's really the next attack vector, is everything else. We've kind of got, our firewalls aren't bad. Our intrusion detection systems aren't too bad. They're a little chatty. Our antivirus is kind of bad. It only detects about 20% of everything you see. But we've kind of got some things under control, but there's a whole raft of other security data out there that if we don't keep our eyeballs on it, somebody's going to be able to take advantage of us pretty easily. So when thinking about the who, what, when, where, and why, and all of the data that we really need to make sure that we're collecting and examining email. We need to understand when something happened. We need to understand people's browsing history. For example, if you have a proxy system in your organization for surfing the web, most proxies like Blue Coat, even Squid, an open source tool, actually will categorize the different sites you go to. So take me, for example. Over the last week, I have a pretty even pattern of the kinds of sites, the types of sites I go to. I don't go to gun sites. I don't go to religion sites, typically. I don't do those kinds of things. So without really intruding on where people are going and where they're surfing, if I look at the ratio of the different types of sites that people go to, those different categories, and I look 1 week, this is the ratio, and the next week, this ratio has completely changed. That's something we need to pay attention to. We need to be able to dive into databases to understand who the supervisor is of a particular person, to know whether or not the supervisor might have ordered something to be done. We need to know badge data. IP address actually allows us to take a look at location for that particular person. This person is logging in from the motor pool. Well, they're the assistant to the director for HHS for the state of California. Why would they be doing that? I mean, we need to be able to look at those kinds of things around location and really take a look deeply into the data. I mean, I also want to know about vacation schedules, right? So if I don't know if the state of California uses PeopleSoft or some other sort of centralized view for all of its PTO, for its paid time off. But certainly I would love to be able to pull information from that particular database as context to know whether or not this person is actually supposed to be on vacation when they logged into the system and they did some things they weren't supposed to. So again, the who, what, when, where, and why requires us to actually get a lot of contextual data that we're really not looking at. So how do we go from this sort of data reduction strategy to what I would call a data inclusion strategy? And that's really going to take us thinking about that big buzzword, big data. And big data is basically velocity, variety, variability, and volume. Those 4 V's are what really define big data. And those 4 V's are what make it so databases really don't work anymore because of the amount, the different types of data we have, the variability of that data we have out there. So what we really need to do is think about putting it into some sort of a time series index that allows us to answer the when pretty well, that doesn't require sort of any upfront normalization of the data, that allows us to take a look at the data and run statistical analysis on it to figure out if people are doing things more often than they should or less often than they should, or that a session takes longer than it's supposed to on average by some sort of standard deviation. You know, one of the things somebody asked me, what are the most important tools to you as a cybersecurity person? And I said, you know, that changed. 10 years ago, it was my firewalls, my intrusion detection systems, my antivirus. Now, it's my statistics textbook, my imagination, and a subscription to Psychology Today. Because I need to understand what people are doing, I need to apply statistical analysis to those, and I need to use my own creativity and the creativity of others to really understand behaviors and what people are actually doing and try to imagine IT risk scenarios that can all be extracted from the data inside of my time-based series index. And so within that bucket of data, I have information about location, what's the role of the individual, the asset, type, the criticality of that asset maybe to the organization. Maybe it's the application without which the entire agency would not be able to run. The action type and the length of time, all of those kinds of things are important. And then actually spreading this across the organization. So remember those silos and those clocks I described earlier. Well, let's get everybody climbing up out of their silos and IT operations and web analytics and security, compliance, all those folks, and get them onto one sort of data level where they can really begin to look at broader risk to the agency or broader risk to the state or a municipality, and really create a sort of a single layer of data. Understand role-based access is important, understand separation of duties are important, but at some level, we need to be able to reduce that 8-hour window down to what Kevin Mandiant says about 4 hours from incident detection to resolution. And that was his stated goal at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce cybersecurity event in D.C. I was at about 2 weeks ago, where we kicked off Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So when we think about that, when we think about the communication gaps we have, the time gaps, we really need one layer. So how do we combat this stuff? Is there kind of a playbook for advanced persistent attackers? And I'm going to give you what's going to be in the next 12 months, the next sort of big buzzword, and that's called the kill chain. And anybody familiar with the kill chain, with kill chain analysis? Okay, cool. All right, so I'm not going to be, nobody knows. So I can just make up whatever I want. No, actually, I'm going to describe it to you this way. Think of a football game, right? All you've seen football games. I have seen too many. And think of yourselves as always on defense. Always on defense. You never get the ball, right? And you've got an offense out there. And they do certain things at certain times. You know, they'll come out on the field, they'll huddle up, they'll line up. Most of the time, the quarterback is under center. Sometimes the quarterback steps back a few feet. Sometimes the wide receivers line up toward the line. Sometimes they go way out. Sometimes there are 4 wide receivers. Sometimes there are 2 backs behind the quarterback. Lots of different patterns. Well, the kill chain represents a pattern of activity. And as you look as the defense at the offense, and you begin to see things, you begin to react, or you begin to suspect what that offense is actually doing. So, in a football game, right? What's your objective as the defense? You want to try and tackle somebody behind the line of scrimmage. That would be really great. You want to intercept a pass. You want to not let them get a first down. You want to do all of those kinds of things. And the way that defenses do that is by examining the patterns of activity of that offense on the field. So when you begin to think about the kill chain, just think of it as John Madden's playbook of defense or offense, and then try to figure out what you want to do on defense to try to counter that. So when we think about the kill chain and we think about the patterns that we've seen that we can now sort of distinguish for advanced threats, there are some objectives that they want to perform. Those attackers, they want stealth. They want to stay resident as long as possible. They want to collect any kind of high value data. They want to have their malware act like an insider or like a regular user in some respects, and they're hacking the human. They do all of this based on trust. The kill chain idea originally came from the military, and it's a find, fix, track, target, engage, and assess kind of thing that's been adopted by the folks at Northrop Grumman and Cisco and Fidelity Investments and other sort of commercial organizations to look like this. And so when they talk about the kill chain, they're looking at it as a sort of a game film for the advanced threats. So you've got reconnaissance, weaponize, deliver, exploit, control, execute, and maintain. And this is the beginning of an attack is out here. And then maintain is where I'm inside your network and I'm actually taking data out. So huddle, line up, passing play, formation, the execution of that play, that would be sort of analogous to what you see up here. And you want to actually try to stop in the football play. You want to stop the play as early as you possibly can, right? You want to try to tackle that person behind the line. But hey, intercepting a pass in the end zone is cool too. Don't get me wrong. I mean, if I get all the way down the play and I'm to here and I basically grab that pass in the air and I run it back for a touchdown, that's okay. But if I see the players line up, and then I see the quarterback under center, and then I see some wide receivers start in motion, and maybe there's a play action, and I recognize that pattern, I want to stop the play at any one of those kinds of points. So I'm going to sort of define these for you, and actually between the MITRE organization, which has now adopted this, and a number of other organizations, they're coming out with sort of variants on this. But basically, I'm harvesting emails. I talk a lot to people. My presentations get posted on websites. Guess what I don't put in my presentations anymore? My email address. I've stopped doing it. If somebody wants an email address from me, I'll give them a card. I'll give any of you a card after the event, after our discussion here. But I've stopped doing that kind of stuff because it ends up on the internet. And I'm just like, I don't want to be reconned. I don't want my email harvested. I don't want people to try to use my email address to find out my LinkedIn, information, for example. I also want to look at weaponization. Basically, it's developing an exploit, so I need to know sort of what the typical kinds of exploit tools there are out there and how they act. So that's kind of my own knowledge about the way the offense is going to line up on the field. I need to know kind of what's available to people to actually weaponize. And then I want to actually I want to look at delivery for spear phishing. 100 people in your organization get one email, different subject, different text, but every email has exactly the same web link. You want to be able to take a look at that statistically and figure that out. You want to be able to look at your email logs and figure out that that's happening. I want to be able to, as an attacker, I want to gain a foothold in your organization. I want to install a Trojan or a backdoor on your system. Antivirus is kind of a failed kind of business, I'm sorry to say. Because let's just say I find maybe I'm a Sophos customer or a McAfee customer or a Symantec SEP customer, and I happen to find a piece of malware in my organization. And I go, wow, that's kind of cool. First, it's cool I found it. But second, I'm going to send that to the organization that I use they use their antivirus, and ask them to dissect it and tell me how it works. So I send it up there, and I wait, and I wait, and I wait. Maybe 24 hours, maybe a week, I don't know. A lot of time goes by. And if I'm lucky, they'll send me back some information on it, and they'll say, oh, okay, this is what we found, this is what we did. And I say, great, I've got 25,000 endpoints, what do I do? I said, well, you're going to have to wait for a signature from us. Okay, that takes another few days. And then I've got to deploy that signature to all of my endpoints. And that's going to take me a little while to do. And sure enough, 2.5 weeks go by in that entire process. And at that point, that piece of malware that I'm going to get a protection for really isn't relevant anymore, because there are now 5,000 variants that don't necessarily meet that criteria. So the thing I've actually found really doesn't have any relevance after a few weeks. And so all of those variants I'm still subject to. So the speed with which that sort of thing happens, attackers take advantage of that as well. And then command and control, I want to be able to know whether or not things like URL links. For example, if I'm watching my web data or my logs from my proxy, I'm watching people surf the web, and this URL happens to be 10 times greater than the average over the last week across my entire organization. Well, what does that tell me? Well, it tells me there's probably command and control instructions embedded in that, or there's probably SQL injection commands embedded in that are not supposed to be there. And that actually is the sign that there is some sort of malware communication going on from inside my organization to somewhere else. And then actions on target are, of course, all the bad things that happen if you don't tackle behind the line, if you don't intercept that pass, if you don't stop the attacker. What you end up with is you've got somebody inside of your organization unknowingly being what I would call a data mule and sending information outbound to somewhere else. So that's kind of the activities defined. And you're going to get this presentation anyway, so I'm not going to go deep into this because I know we have a limited amount of time together. But I'm going to go through and just talk about some of the different types of activities that you can perform to sort of map into that kind of kill chain and activity, or that pattern to sort of watch for. And you want to kind of get an understanding of web analytics. You want to understand, and believe it or not, web analytics is actually important to security people, because you get an understanding of the clicks on the management portion of a website, or who the directors are in the organization. And you actually can get information from Google about the different hits or the different requests for information about your site on Google, and actually get the language information. You know, is it unusual for someone to be surfing the web looking for information about your agency from Iran or from Bolivia or from weird countries? I mean, usually those people usually aren't doing that. There are not really that many expatriates out there living in Iran from California, I would think. So Google Analytics is something that a lot of marketing people use to try to figure out how successful their marketing is for a particular website. So if you can get access to that, that's really important. Social media, there are companies out there now. One of them is called DataSift. And DataSift actually does this really cool thing where they look at all the tweets that are out there, and they embellish that information for you if you subscribe to them. They embellish that information with not only do they give you the handle of that person and the hashtags and all that, but they'll actually tell you the name of the person who tweeted that, the real name. They'll get that, They'll also get the IP address, where it came from. They'll also get a variety of other pieces of information, the sex of the individual, all that kind of information. And if you're in a department in the state of California, and you're looking at healthcare data, for example, and you know the names of all of your employees, you can then take that list of employees, and if you have a subscription to DataSift, you can actually compare that list of employees with the tweets that are coming from those employees, potentially about healthcare issues for other employees, and maybe even applications for assistance you have that you're processing. So taking a look at that also underscores. Somebody tell me, what's the name of the standard for California? It's based on the NIST 800-53 standard. Sorry? Yeah, thank you. And if I'm not mistaken, that's actually going to be changed, just like the 800-53 standard is, to include information about privacy. So when you take a look going forward at the kinds of data you're going to have to look at to solve and address those kinds of problems, those privacy issues, you're going to have to, again, expand your thinking around social media. Oh, and by the way, LinkedIn has some really cool APIs, and you can actually find out things like who's joining what group. So you could actually take a look and say, okay, this particular person is in a group that I belong to, but they have no background in cybersecurity, and those are the kinds of groups that I belong to. So you can begin to take a look at that kind of thing. You can begin to take a look to find out whether or not this email that was sent to me inside of LinkedIn to ask me to do something, to download a PDF or download something or talk to them, is actually from somebody who has the same background as me or somebody who doesn't. So there are actually ways to get at some of this kind of data. I spent a long time on reconnaissance because that's the one that people seem to understand the least, is that how do attackers get information about my people in my organization? So we also want to use analytics to understand if a piece of email is seen for the very first time inbound from a particular person. We want to monitor the types of attachments, perform packet level inspection. We want to understand whether or not there is some sort of malicious code embedded in that particular JPEG or that particular PDF or some Microsoft Word document that's sent to us, or JavaScript. We want to be able to look at exploitation and installation of malware. There's two sources of really good information. Actually, in my opinion, one better than the other. There's VirusTotal. How many people have heard of VirusTotal? One? Two? Great. So VirusTotal is actually run by Google. And if you actually do find a piece of malware, don't necessarily send it to your antivirus vendor. Go online, go to VirusTotal, submit it to them. And they will actually, it's run by Google, and it's free, and they will give you back all of the information that they have about that particular malware. And not only that, if it's new, they'll actually sandbox it and run it to try to give you additional information about it. Who does it connect to? What IP addresses, what domains, all that kind of information. And once you have that information, then you can begin to watch for people actually going to those particular sites or going to those particular IP addresses. GTRI's Apiary project is really pretty cool. That's run by the Georgia Tech Research Institute. And they're in beta with their service now, so at least for now it's free. And they have a much more extensive sort of analysis that they do of malware, and malware not only from traditional kinds of sources, but also Android, bare metal. They support a whole variety of different malware analysis that you can actually submit malware to them and get back information about that, just like you can from VirusTotal. However, the difference between VirusTotal and GTRI is kind of interesting. If there's a free service out there that's pretty good, and Google's is pretty good, it's free, they don't vet who uses it, guess who wants to use that to try to figure out whether their malware is going to be quiet? Attackers. So that's also the place that attackers will put their malware into to say, hey, I wonder if this is going to be detected by VirusTotal. And they try over and over and over again until it's quiet. GTRI actually vet who uses their service. So at least there's that kind of a thing there. VirusTotal can be used by anybody. So you can take that data, You could put it into Splunk, or you could put it into another system if you wanted to. You're going to get the hash of the malware. You're going to get communication IPs, ports and protocols used, all that kind of information. And you're going to actually be able to monitor for network connection information. They'll actually run the malware in their sandbox again, and actually they can actually tell how it's communicating outbound. You also want to monitor for unusual or rare traffic between hosts for lateral movement, things of that nature, and then monitor changes to host processes. And command and control, not everybody surfs to the same place at exactly the same time of day every single day. Only machines do that. So if you find somebody, if you can discern a pattern using a time series index, a large data store, to be able to understand that I am actually going at 12:02, I'm surfing to this one domain over and over again, that's not good. That's bad. Also, there's other things that can be done. The information about the registry of new domains is available at no cost. You can download that, and again, with a big data system, I can begin to say, okay, what new domains have been registered in the last 24 hours? Okay, and which of my hosts or which of my users might be surfing to any of those brand spanking new domains? Because more than likely, if it's in the last 24 hours, that's a problem. That means that was set up specifically for malware, and I've got people actually communicating outbound to those kinds of things. And then finally, there's lots of actions on target. I'm not going to go through this because I want to get quickly through the next section. But these are all the bad things that can happen, or evidence that you've got a real problem. CPU cycles eaten up, and this is one of the classic finger-pointing kinds of examples where 100 of my web servers spiked to 90% CPU utilization all at the same time. Security problem, IT problem, both. Who knows, right? So again, having that sort of single big data layer where we can all look at the same data is really important. This is really a tall order. Thinking through this kind of problem, let alone describing it to an audience. And I try to do it as best I can as a football game, but really describing it is all really hard. The earlier in the chain you are to focus and find a problem, the better off you are. You got to know your environment. You got to know where the keys to the kingdom are. You have to know where your configuration documents are. You have to know where all that kind of stuff is, and protect it, and really protect it. I mean, source code for your applications that are running your agencies, my God, that's really important stuff. So, how do you start? How do you start with a big data system? And so what I've been telling people is, don't start with the 300 rules that I had on my SIM, and those same 300 rules that SIM vendor vends to every single customer out there, no matter what their agency, no matter what their mission, no matter what their vertical. Start with asking some basic questions. First of all, identify a business or agency issue. What are the things that our agency cares about? What could cause us the most harm? How could we end up in the newspaper? What does performance degradation look like, and what kind of harm would that cause? Unplanned outages, all of those kinds of things, those are agency and business issues. So once you have those kinds of issues, then construct some kind of hypothesis. How could someone gain access to data that should be kept private? What could cause a mass system of outage that we all care about? All of those kinds of things. And then have dissatisfied patrons or citizens to boot. And then we want to find out, okay, well, what might evidence these problems? What kind of data would we want to collect to try to understand those kinds of things? Maybe we need VPN data, Active Directory data, wireless information, application information. Whatever we need to determine that, and then get the subject matter expert in the room who understands that information, that log data, who wrote the application, the custom application you're using to power your agency, in a room, and get them to say, what the heck does this mean in this data? And once they tell you that, then move on to the next phase for understanding what kind of searches do we want to run of our big data store, of our time series index. What kind of searches do we want to run to try to find out what's going on? What kind of patterns do we want to look for? What kind of, based on length of time, time of day, role, where a person is at a particular time, all those kinds of things that happen. And then figure out whether or not there are any mitigating factors to interpreting those kinds of threats. If 10 people log in at midnight to the finance servers, is that a bad thing? Well, most of the time, probably yes. But if it's the end of the quarter, I can see a scenario where they might all be working late to try to finish out the books. So maybe I want to try to exclude that time frame somehow from the rest of this. So being able to go through that and look at statistical models that you might want to use to try to figure out what's good behavior and what's bad behavior. So attacks of the future are going to require risk-based scenario thinking. And they're going to grow in sophistication. They're going to start in places you would not imagine. The gas pumps at the motor pool, for example, may be IP connected via software to other places. So if I can gain access to those somehow, or I can change the way those operate, maybe I can bridge from there to other systems in an organization. I love this picture. There's a wading pool, and there's a small child, and there's this giant shark jumping out of the wading pool. And it says, nobody expects the wading pool shark. And believe it or not, that's kind of where we all are, is we're waiting for this big shark to come out of our wading pools and really surprise us. And we don't want to do that. We want to try to actually think through IT risk scenarios, and the crazier the better in some cases. They're going to be much more individualized. They're going to be motivated by all the things I've got up there. So it really means expanding the scope of data collection, the big data problem, and it really means expanding your mind to think through these sort of IT risk scenarios and really trying to grow a platform for risk for the organization across applications, security data, operations data, business process information, distribution systems, everything, to try to maintain and create separate views for all those groups, but linked together at that big data layer. And I realize I just sort of skirted right in there with about 3 minutes before the top of the hour. Thanks for listening to me ramble on for a while. I hope that you came away with some information that you can take back to your office and to begin to think about how you might use a big data system to try to address security threats of the future. Thanks.